Dali, Mpofu and Thembeka Ngcukaitobi have arrived in Zimbabwe to join the MDC Alliance's legal team. Now, the opposition party is challenging ZANU-PF's win in last month's elections. The challenge will be heard in court on Wednesday. ZANU-PF is opposing that application. Let's get you the very latest on the story now. Aldrin Sampier, of course, you've been tracking the story of Zimbabwe for us for some time. You were there during the elections themselves. Aldrin, just take us through exactly what landed us up in court.
Well, the argument from the MDC Alliance is that the process leading up to the elections were not free and fair, and there were issues leading up to the elections, for instance, access to the voters' roll. And this is something that has been raised by the observer missions as well, that the voters' roll were not given in time to the various parties contesting the election. So on that basis, there are issues being raised there. But most importantly, what is leading us up to this case that will be heard on Wednesday at the Constitutional Court is the counting of the votes. The MDC Alliance, as Nelson Chamisa, is making the argument that there were irregularities in the counting of the votes, and the votes that have been announced, the results that were announced by the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission do not correspond to the results that are on the website. And there's one of the other presidential candidates who's also supporting Nelson Chamisa's case, who has also led evidence to that effect that shows that the announcement of the results on TV are different to the results that are published on the website of the Electoral Commission. The Electoral Commission's chairperson, Priscilla Chikumba, then in her court papers stated that there were data errors in calculating of these results. But she says that even after this has been fixed, even after you put in the correct data, Emmerson Mnangagwa still meets the requirement or the threshold of a 50% plus one. And this is an issue because what we must remember is that Emmerson Mnangagwa won just by that. Yeah. By 8%, by 0.8%. Yeah. And that's the reason why Nelson Chamisa, as well as the entire team, and I guess Dali, Mpofu, as well as Advocate Ngcukaitobi, believes that there is a case that the Electoral Commission needs to answer to.
So what requires a win is 50% plus one 50%. Vote. Not 50 plus 1%, it's 50%
plus one vote.
Now, when Priscilla Chikumba announced that there was this data discrepancy, did she say when that data discrepancy was picked up? Because surely you don't release the results of an elections when you're not 100% certain of those results themselves.
She doesn't say in the court papers, and we'll have to wait for Wednesday when her legal counsel will be explaining to the Constitutional Court in Zimbabwe when exactly this data error was picked up and why this error was not fixed before the announcement of the results. I assume that they only picked up the data error per se after the MDC Alliance lodged their case, because remember that the complaint from the MDC Alliance did not go directly to the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission. They went straight to the court because they've already made the case and made the argument that they believe that the Electoral Commission is in bed with ZANU-PF, as well as the president-elect now, Emmerson Mnangagwa, who have, as you've indicated, that his inauguration has now been halted pending the outcome of this Constitutional Court case.
Now, you mentioned that the Electoral Commission, ZEC, the Electoral Commission in Zimbabwe, is widely believed to be beholden to ZANU-PF. The same could be said for the judiciary. Is the MDC Alliance assured of a fair trial, taking this to the Constitutional Court?
They believe that they could get a fair trial, but as you said, even before heading into the elections, in some cases that have been lodged by the MDC Alliance as well, those cases were not really victorious in the court of law. And they have made the argument that the judiciary in Zimbabwe is in bed with the ZANU-PF as well as the government of the day. But we'll have to wait and see how this plays out. Because the other thing as well is when you cast aspersions on the judiciary ahead of such a crucial hearing, that you've almost made the argument that even whatever ruling comes out of this court, it would have already been tainted. But it seems as though that they're placing some credence and expectations that they hope that this judiciary will actually live up to their expectations. But what are their expectations? Their expectations are that they hope that the Constitutional Court will say that the processes have been flouted leading up to the elections and also after the elections with the counting of the votes. Now that we have this admission from the Electoral Commission that there was some errors in the data capturing, that there must be a rerun of the elections. Another problem for the government of Zimbabwe is the cost.
You're saying that the MDC Alliance would want to have a rerun
of the elections. The other problem is that there will be a cost involved in this. Do you want to go? Do you want to start all over again and just probably do a recount of the elections? But the problem is, it's not only a recount of the elections or the results thereof, but it's also the processes leading up to the elections. One of the issues, for instance, that they raise is how traditional leaders play quite a pivotal role in the society of Zimbabwe. They say that traditional leaders have been intimidating villagers in the various villages in Zimbabwe, in the various provinces in Zimbabwe, to vote for ZANU-PF. But this has also been something that has been raised by SADC, some of the observer missions. SADC, for one, has said that there has been this issue that has been raised with us. Although the African Union did not pronounce on it, they did also say that they have received some of these complaints that the traditional leaders are intimidating some of the villages. Another issue is that the traditional leaders must not play any role whatsoever when it comes to the process of working within the elections. The MDC Alliance is saying that in some provinces, traditional leaders were allowed to be party agents, and that is not allowed. What Emerson Mnangagwa is saying in his court papers, as well as Priscilla Chikumba in her court papers, is that why wasn't this complaint raised before the elections actually took place? This is the first time that we are hearing of these complaints.
Now, I just want to talk about this issue of, you mentioned traditional leaders perhaps intimidating voters in the run-up to the polls and the polls themselves. This issue of intimidation, the Zimbabwe Solidarity Forum in the run-up to the elections had said, observer missions are in the country, yes, and they ended up saying that the elections were in fact free and mostly fair. But the type of intimidation you're dealing with is not something that outsiders would necessarily pick up. Do you get that sense now, looking back?
It's not something that you pick up physically, that this person has been intimidated, and whether people are willing to come forward and say that I have a case of intimidation where a certain chief, a certain traditional leader has intimidated us or has intimidated my family. It's very subtle.
Yeah.
Another issue that the MDC Alliance has raised as well is what they call vote buying, where they say that the ZANU-PF government, leading up to the elections, had gone to these various villages and have offered people seeds, and have offered people food parcels. And they're saying that this is against the law of Zimbabwe, and this was not nipped in the bud by the Zimbabwean Electoral Commission.
So, okay, take us through just very quickly before we wrap up the story for the moment, Aldrin. These two top lawyers, South African lawyers, now making their way, they've arrived in Zimbabwe, I understand. Was that at the behest of the MDC Alliance, or did they see that they could make a difference in this case?
It was, I understand from speaking to the spokesperson of the MDC Alliance and the spokesperson of Nelson Chamisa, is that they had requested them to be part of this case, although Mpofu, who is a Zimbabwean advocate, will be the lead counsel. The role that Advocate Ngcukaitobi as well as Dali Mpofu will be playing is just a supportive role. They are not allowed by the laws of that country to argue in front of a court of law. But the MDC Alliance say that because Ngcukaitobi as well as Advocate Dali Mpofu have been constitutionalists, people have argued in front of the Constitutional Court here in South Africa, they believe that with their expertise, they would be able to win this court case. And of course, it's quite a tight deadline, because the Constitution of Zimbabwe says that after complaint has been lodged, so the complaint must be lodged within 7 days after the results have been announced. And after that complaint has been lodged, the date, there's still a dispute around the date when it was lodged. Some say it was on the 10th, some say it was on the 11th. And now this is between the disputing parties. On the 10th or the 11th, then the case is being heard on the 22nd. Within 2 days after that argument, or 2 or 3 days, there must be a ruling. So the Constitutional Court of that country certainly has a tight deadline to make sure that they pronounce on this matter, and at least give Emerson Mnangagwa some assurance whether he will be inaugurated as president of the country or whether not.
So by next Friday, we might have an
certainly,
outcome there.
yeah.
All right, well, thanks very much for that update. Our reporter Alton Sampier, of course, has been covering the story of the Zimbabwe elections for us for